In a sleepy pocket of Wisconsin, the town of Delafield stood as a quiet testament to the simple life. In places like New York or LA, the pulsing veins of activity might offer police officers a daily buffet of crime. But Delafield? It was a serene haven, a place where life revolved around small dramas and Sunday church confessions. With a modest population of around 10,000 souls, the town lay nestled amidst vast expanses of farmland, stretching as far as the eyes could see. Delafield's usual roster of crime was quaint at its worst. A couple of the local boys letting liquor get the best of them, or mischievous teenagers leaving their mark on some poor farmer's barn. Maybe, on a wild day, someone would break into old Mrs. Richardson's house. Not that she had anything worth stealing, but it was the principle of the thing. My tenure as a police officer in this town, which by and large was marked by routine and humdrum, had one black spot, a memory that still raised the hairs on my neck when I thought about it after dark. Delafield was the kind of place folks would casually drive through, perhaps with a hint of envy for its serenity, or maybe with a sense of disdain for its lack of excitement. But those people didn't know about the case of Mrs. Fitzgerald, the one that still danced macabrely in my dreams. 7 years ago, when the chill of winter was just lifting its frosty veil and giving way to spring, I was 5 years into my job. We were a small brigade of lawmen: Philip, my partner, Ben and Derek, who held the fort at night, our chief, and Tracy. Tracy was an intriguing mix of bookworm and town crier, having once been a librarian and now the one who brought us our tidings over the radio. Our humble precinct was part of the town's municipal building, equipped with 2 offices and a trio of jail cells, though I doubt all 3 were ever used at the same time. One particular day, when the skies were painted gray and the soft patter of rain offered a soothing backdrop, Philip and I were cruising around town. The voice of Tracy, always calm yet tinged with a hint of excitement, buzzed through the radio. Possible 1082 at the Fitzgerald residence on Palmer Road. A burglary. Mrs. Deborah Fitzgerald, an aging widow, had become a staple caller for us. She lived in a weathered farmhouse on the town's outskirts, the kind where every creak of the floorboards told stories of generations gone by. After the passing of her husband, she was left with her vast, echoing house and her memories. Her children had moved away, and from the looks of it, forgotten the path back. Stories about her were whispered, sometimes with a chuckle, sometimes with a sigh. From phantom intruders in her attic that turned out to be raccoons, to claimed UFO sightings over her cornfields, she had quite the repertoire. Philip and I, more often than not, found ourselves responding to her calls, knowing they'd probably be false alarms. But we went, every time. Each visit would follow a familiar script. Calm Mrs. Fitzgerald, assure her she was safe, then head back to recount the tales to our colleagues. Derek and Ben, with a smirk playing on their lips, would entertain us with their own versions of her wild claims. But underneath it all, there was a real concern. Mrs. Fitzgerald's solitary existence in that sprawling house wasn't just melancholy. It was a ticking time bomb. A day could come when her frantic call wasn't just her imagination playing tricks, but a genuine cry for help. We tried to assure her that everything was okay, that we had searched the whole place and there was no one there. We tried to console her with familiar words, but given the chaotic state of her home and her severe deterioration, our typical placations felt particularly empty. As we attempted to calm her, Mrs. Fitzgerald's grip tightened on our arms, her bony fingers digging into our flesh. "Every night, it comes," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I hear it, moving, whispering. It watches me." Her gaze darted around the room as if expecting something to leap out at any moment. Philip took a deep breath, his face a mix of sympathy and concern. "Mrs. Fitzgerald, have you been taking any medication lately? Maybe something that might be causing you to see or hear things that aren't really there?" he inquired gently. She shook her head vehemently, her eyes still darting to the shadows. No medicine. I've seen it. It's real. Not a ghost, not a hallucination. It's something else." We exchanged glances, uncertain of how to proceed. It was clear she was deeply disturbed, but her terror seemed genuine, not the result of some drug or a figment of her imagination. "Mrs. Fitzgerald," I started, choosing my words carefully, Have you thought about maybe staying with a family member or a friend for a while, just until things settle down? For your peace of mind. Her face crumpled. I've tried, but they never listen. They think I've lost my mind, that I'm making all of this up. But it's real, I swear. We sat with her, trying to piece together the puzzle of what might have occurred. Her fragmented recollections painted a picture of sleepless nights, of strange noises, and even stranger occurrences in her home. Most alarming of all, she claimed that she had seen a figure, shadowy and distorted, moving around her house during the night. After some time, we decided it would be best for Mrs. Fitzgerald to come with us to the station. Not under arrest, of course, but so she wouldn't be alone, and we could get her some help. She reluctantly agreed, looking back at her house with tear-filled eyes as we helped her into the patrol car. Philip and I couldn't shake the eerie feeling as we left the old farmhouse behind. We had encountered many calls in our career, but something about this one stuck with us. A nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was more to Mrs. Fitzgerald's tale than we were willing to admit. We would soon discover just how much more. 3 days ago, Philip repeated, leaning forward with a look of both concern and disbelief. Mrs. Fitzgerald took a deep, shuddering breath before continuing. Yes. 3 days ago, I woke up to the sounds of the pounding again, only this time it wasn't just from the closets. It was from every door and window in the house. The same terrible voice was calling out my name in that guttural tone, and this time, it was louder than it had ever been. I watched as she clutched her rosary tighter in her frail hands, her eyes glazing over slightly as if she were reliving the nightmare. I could hear the voice whispering sinister threats and promises of pain. It echoed throughout the house, making it impossible for me to pinpoint its exact source. She paused, tears starting to gather in her eyes. I hid in the bathroom, the only room with no closets. And then, in the deafening silence that followed, I heard soft, mocking laughter coming from the other side of the bathroom door. It knew where I was. Philip's face had grown pale. Mrs. Fitzgerald, why didn't you call someone? The police, a neighbor, anyone. She shook her head. I tried. But every time I picked up the phone, the line would be dead, and then that dreadful voice would laugh on the other end. It wanted me isolated, trapped. But what about during the daytime? You could have left the house then, I pointed out, trying to make sense of her ordeal. Mrs. Fitzgerald looked down, tears spilling onto her cheeks. I did, twice, but every time I got to the edge of my property, I felt an overpowering force pulling me back. It was as if invisible chains were yanking me towards the house. I could barely resist, and each time I found myself back in the living room, unable to leave. Philip and I exchanged a worried glance. As surreal and unbelievable as her story sounded, the sheer terror in Mrs. Fitzgerald's voice and demeanor made it hard to doubt her sincerity. And last night, she whispered, her voice quaking. I saw it again, not in a mirror, but standing at the foot of my bed as I tried to sleep on the couch. The hooded figure with the skull face and those malevolent red eyes. It just stood there, watching me, and then it pointed at me, a bony finger accusing me, marking me. She took a deep, trembling breath. That's when I knew I couldn't endure another night alone. I had to call someone, and I called you. Philip and I sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing her harrowing account. Whether it was a manifestation of a deteriorating mind or a genuine supernatural occurrence, it was clear that Mrs. Fitzgerald was in severe distress. We'll stay with you tonight, Mrs. Fitzgerald, Philip finally said, determination evident in his voice. We'll find out what's really happening here. I nodded in agreement. We won't let you face this alone anymore. Then the terror began to invade her every waking hour. Daylight brought no respite. No matter the hour, there was no sanctuary. Every corner of the house felt heavy with the presence of the entity. Its relentless pounding had grown more aggressive, shaking every closet door so violently, it felt as though the house itself would come apart. Mrs. Fitzgerald recounted how, in sheer desperation, she'd turned to faith. She'd knelt with her Bible, reciting prayers, hoping divine intervention might offer her a shield. Yet, her acts of faith seemed only to incense the malevolent force more, its jeering laughter echoing around her as it continued its assault. Reaching her limit, Mrs. Fitzgerald had grabbed Neil's old shotgun. After firing a shot through one of the closet doors, everything went silent. The respite was short-lived. Peering through the bullet hole, she was met with two glowing, malevolent red eyes, gazing back with chilling intent. The voice that followed, now mocking her, uttered a single word that struck terror in her heart. Tonight. Philip and I shared a glance, unease heavy in the air. The weight of her words was palpable, even though rational thought said otherwise. It was evident that something had pushed Mrs. Fitzgerald to the edge, mentally and emotionally. Upon discussing privately, we decided it was crucial for Mrs. Fitzgerald's safety that she leave the house. We made arrangements for her to stay at a nearby motel, offering her a reprieve, and suggesting we'd contact a priest to bless her house. As we escorted her, there was a marked change in her demeanor. The motel's nondescript environment seemed to ease her anxiety. After ensuring she was settled, we left, promising to check on her the next day. But the morning never brought the hoped-for relief. The chief's call pulled me out of sleep with a sense of foreboding. The crime scene at the motel confirmed my worst fears. Mrs. Fitzgerald had vanished. Neighbors reported hearing bone-chilling screams, and when officers arrived, the room painted a horrific scene. Blood was everywhere, with trails suggesting she'd fought desperately against an unseen force, her fingers leaving bloody marks across the room, leading to one place: the closet. As I stood there, surrounded by the chaos of the room, I couldn't help but think back to her words and the voice's promise. Tonight. A chilling realization washed over me. The entity wasn't bound to her house, it was bound to her. Rebecca's eyes seemed to get lost in memories for a moment. "Farley's used to make the best malts in town, you know." This was another puzzling statement. There hadn't been a Farley's pharmacy in town for decades. Rebecca continued, "I was just about to leave when someone approached me. He was a tall man, wearing a fedora pulled low over his eyes, and he had this sinister smile. The next thing I knew, he had grabbed me, pulling me into a nearby alley. I tried to scream, but he slapped a hand over my mouth. He began to drag me towards a black car parked nearby." Tears began to well up in her eyes as she recalled the traumatic event. "I thought I was going to die, but then by some miracle I managed to bite his hand." He yelped in pain and released his grip on me for just a moment. That was all I needed. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back. I ran through alleys, streets, and even jumped across backyards until I felt safe. "And that's when I found myself here," she finished, her voice shaky. The chief, Ben, and I exchanged uneasy glances. There were too many inconsistencies in her story. From the old-fashioned clothing, mentions of classic movies, to Farley's pharmacy and the tool store on Main Street, her story seemed to be coming straight out of a different era. "I want to help you, Rebecca," the chief started, trying to keep his voice calm and soothing. "But some of the places you're mentioning, they don't exist anymore. They haven't been around for years." Rebecca looked puzzled for a moment, then realization dawned on her face and her eyes filled with terror. "It's happening again," she whispered, almost to herself. Ben leaned in. "What's happening again, Rebecca?" Rebecca looked directly into his eyes, her voice trembling with fear. I think I'm not where I'm supposed to be." For a moment, the room was enveloped in tense silence, the weight of Rebecca's words sinking in. It was hard to dismiss the idea that something otherworldly was going on, especially when presented with such a bewildering and chilling account. The chief took a deep breath. "Rebecca, we'll do our best to help you. We need to look into this and figure out what's going on." He then motioned for me to join him outside. Stepping out into the corridor, the chief whispered, "I've heard stories from the old-timers about the cinema showing classic movies, and Farley's pharmacy being the place to go on a Friday night. But that was all before our time. Could it be possible that she's from the past?" "I don't know, Chief," I replied, my voice heavy with uncertainty. "But whatever's going on, we need to get to the bottom of it." Meanwhile, back in the room, Ben was trying to calm Rebecca down, reassuring her that we were on her side. But as the night wore on, it became clear that Rebecca's tale was just the beginning of a series of events that would challenge our understanding of time, reality, and the very fabric of our town's history. "Rebecca," the chief began gently. It's not 1956, it's 2023. She stared at him, her face turning an even paler shade. That can't be. That's impossible. Her voice cracked, filled with disbelief. We believe you experienced something traumatic tonight, Rebecca, Ben interjected, attempting to help make sense of the situation. But there are inconsistencies in your story that make it hard to piece together. She looked around the room, eyes darting from the chief to Ben, then to me. I don't understand, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. I remember everything so clearly. The chief leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. Let's set aside the details about the year and the town's history for now, he said gently. What's most important is finding out if there's a dangerous man out there. We'll help you and investigate your claims. Do you think you can work with us on that? Rebecca nodded weakly, wiping away her tears. Yes, I just want him caught. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. I understand, said the chief compassionately. Now, about that phone call. Before she could answer, the station's phone began to ring. Ben moved swiftly to pick it up, listened for a moment, and then held the receiver out to the chief. It's for you, Chief. Someone claiming they might have information about the crash Rebecca mentioned. The room went silent as the chief took the call. As he spoke, Rebecca's eyes widened, and she clutched the blanket tighter around her, her face a picture of growing horror. As the chief hung up, he looked back at us with a serious expression. There's been a car found submerged in a nearby lake, a vintage Dodge, and there's an out-of-state license plate. They haven't identified the driver, but initial reports say he was dressed as a priest and had a crutch. Rebecca's face turned ashen. It's him, I told you. The reality of the situation began to dawn on us all, leaving us with more questions than answers. How could Rebecca, a woman from the past, lead us to a present-day crime scene? The boundaries of time and reality seemed to blur, and as we set out to investigate further, we knew we were delving into something beyond the realm of the ordinary. No, Rebecca, the chief said, his voice soft but firm, full of genuine concern. It's not 1956 anymore. It's 2023. She looked at him, confusion evident in her eyes. 2023? You must be joking. How is that even possible? The chief, pointing to the electronic calendar displayed prominently on the screen of his computer, urged, Take a look for yourself, Rebecca. He gestured for her to come closer. Skeptically, she walked over, her eyes locked onto the glowing numbers on the screen. She blinked a few times as if expecting the numbers to change. Her gaze then shifted to a map on the adjacent wall, where she noticed Hawaii and Alaska displayed as states. When did they? She mumbled to herself, her fingers trembling. Distracted by the sight outside the window, her eyes widened even further. Those cars, she exclaimed, pointing to the futuristic-looking vehicles in the parking lot. They're like nothing I've ever seen before. The room was thick with tension as she turned to face us, her eyes now brimming with tears. With her face pale and her breathing erratic, she whispered, I don't feel right. I think I'm going to be sick. She swayed slightly, clutching her stomach. Seeing her distress, Ben swiftly moved to her side, lending her his arm for support. The chief, always quick to act, motioned to him, his eyes conveying a silent message to keep a close eye on her. As Ben led her out, presumably towards the restroom, the room was left in an eerie quiet. The heavy silence seemed to stretch on, only broken by the soft rustle of the jigsaw puzzle pieces the chief was toying with. Then, with a sigh, I tried to break the tension. Never thought I'd see a day like this, Chief. He merely hummed, deep in thought. What's on your mind, Chief? I finally asked, looking at him for any indication of what he was thinking. The chief took a moment, then leaned back, rubbing his temples. Remember the old tales about O'Donnell's tool store? How it was here when I was young? The missing daughter tale? I nodded, though a little impatiently. Yes, but do you honestly think there's a connection? His eyes, troubled, met mine. It's a theory. This town has seen its fair share of mysteries. He hinted at another unsolved case, one that still gave me nightmares. The bloody motel room, where the evidence indicated a violent struggle, but no bodies were ever found. Before I could respond, a panicked shout from down the hallway pulled us from our conversation. It was Ben, calling for us, his voice filled with urgency. What now? I muttered, concern gnawing at me as we rushed towards him. Ben stood outside the restroom, his face pale, sweat glistening on his forehead. She's disappeared, he stuttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The chief's face darkened. What do you mean, disappeared? You were watching her. Ben, looking even more frazzled, gestured towards the empty restroom. I was right here, I swear. She just vanished. My heart raced. Could this really be happening? The events of the evening were spiraling into the realm of the unexplainable, and as we stood in that hallway, the weight of the mystery bore down on us, challenging us to unravel it. Ben's voice shook as he spoke, a tremor of fear that I had never heard from him before. When I was helping her up to go to the restroom, he stammered, I felt her arm. It was cold. His gaze met mine, the terror in his eyes speaking volumes. Cold? I pressed, trying to make sense of it all. He nodded, swallowing hard. Not just chilly, ice cold, like the skin of someone who's been dead for a while. The chief and I exchanged a grim look, both recalling another time, another case, when we had encountered something equally unsettling. The incident from 14 had left a scar on all of us, and the similarities were starting to become too conspicuous to ignore. Without another word, the chief and I stepped into the women's restroom, the sterile fluorescent lights casting a pale glow on everything. The room was eerily silent and seemingly unchanged. The 3 stalls stood open and unoccupied. The lone sink gleamed under the harsh lighting, but it was the window above it that caught my attention. Drawn to it, I approached, half expecting it to be locked from the inside. To my surprise, it was ajar. The window's not latched, I called out, a strange mix of relief and anxiety coursing through me. The relief came from knowing there was a possible logical explanation for Rebecca's sudden disappearance. The anxiety, however, stemmed from the realization that if she had indeed escaped through this window, then where had she gone? Without waiting for a reply, the chief motioned for us to follow him, urgency evident in his strides. We made our way out of the building and onto the dimly lit grounds, following the direction the window faced. Turning the corner, we were met with an expanse of well-maintained grass leading to the edge of the road. The window, standing about 10 feet off the ground, stared back at us, almost challenging in its silence. It was small, but I surmised that someone of Rebecca's stature could feasibly have climbed through it. The freshly mowed lawn, combined with the absence of rain, meant there were no footprints to provide us any clues. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. We stood there, the weight of the situation settling around us, each lost in our thoughts, trying to piece together the evening's events. After what felt like an eternity, the chief let out a soft, uncertain laugh. Guess she was quick on her feet, closing the window behind her before making her getaway, he mused, trying to bring some levity to the situation. Ben, looking equally pensive, chimed in. Could be she was just scared, Chief. Maybe drugged or hallucinating, who knows? I could tell, though, from the way the chief's gaze remained distant, that he wasn't entirely convinced. There was something more to this, a deeper mystery that we were only just beginning to unravel. Shaking off the unease, the chief finally said, Let's head back inside. There's nothing more we can do out here. And with that, we turned on our heels, each of us silently processing the bizarre and unsettling events of the evening. It was much more comforting for us to lean on the simpler explanations. Accepting the idea that we'd interacted with someone merely suffering a breakdown or seeking some form of attention was far easier than confronting the more spectral possibilities. Because if we were to fully embrace the unsettling notion that we might have been conversing with an apparition that summer evening, then our entire understanding of the world would shatter. The chief, being ever diligent, had officially relayed the incident to the state authorities, which consequently issued an alert for Rebecca's whereabouts. Yet no trace of her ever surfaced again. Driven by a mix of professional curiosity and a personal need for closure, I delved into various sources. Digitized newspaper archives, town records, old journal entries. I scoured them all. The narratives consistently confirmed the existence of Rebecca O'Donnell, the 19-year-old offspring of Terence and Catherine O'Donnell of O'Donnell Tools. Her abrupt disappearance in the late summer of 1956 was a chilling fact. Yet I entertained the thought that the erratic woman we encountered might have simply been knowledgeable about Rebecca's story and spun it into her twisted narrative. The absence of photographs from that era added another layer of ambiguity. Any potential family snapshots likely perished in the tragic blaze that claimed her parents. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the bizarre episode with Rebecca faded into the recesses of my memory. It was buried beneath the weight of fresh cases and daily responsibilities. That was until one seemingly routine morning, when the chief, appearing unusually somber, summoned me to his office. Without uttering a word, he gestured toward a newspaper article sprawled on his desk. The headline sent chills down my spine. Lake reveals unravels decades-long mystery. In an adjacent town, a man testing his brand-new sonar equipment had unwittingly detected an ancient automobile submerged 20 feet beneath the lake's surface. The recovered vehicle, a 1953 Dodge corroded by time and water, bore an eerie testament to a long-forgotten tragedy. Inside its decrepit confines was a skeleton, presumably that of a man. The car's license plate traced back to Kansas. It belonged to a nefarious individual sought by the FBI during the mid-1950s, a drifter with a sinister record, believed to have been involved in the disappearances and probable murders of up to 10 young women across several states. An intended victim had once eluded his grasp, recounting a chilling attempt of abduction by a man impersonating a priest in Illinois, bordering Wisconsin. After that incident, this malevolent figure had vanished, eluding the authorities. However, the horrors of that rusted Dodge did not end there. A secondary inspection revealed another macabre find. Another skeleton, this one unmistakably female, concealed within the trunk. The grim revelation struck me with the force of a sledgehammer, and a haunting melody filled the room as the realization dawned upon us.